Some deaths do not merely end a life, they ignite a chain reaction that reshapes the entire world. Some boys are not allowed to live long enough to write their own destiny, and yet their absence carves out a future more terrifying, more glorious, and more unpredictable than anything they could have imagined. Edward, the only legitimate son of King Henry VIII, died at the age of 15, and in doing so, he created the world as we know it. But the real question that haunts history like a ghost is this: what if he had lived? Edward was born on the 12th day of October in the year 1537, and the moment his tiny cry filled the royal chamber at Hampton Court, the whole of England erupted in celebration. Bonfires were lit across the countryside. Church bells rang endlessly, and songs of thanksgiving echoed through cathedral halls. A prince had been born, not just any prince, but the long-awaited male heir to continue the Tudor line, a boy whose very existence seemed to validate the bloodshed, divorces, and religious upheaval of his father's reign. But the joy did not last. Just 12 days after his birth, Edward's mother, Queen Jane Seymour, succumbed to postnatal complications. Henry VIII, finally holding the son he had sacrificed so much to obtain, found his victory wrapped in mourning clothes. In the years that followed, Edward grew tall, sharp-minded, and surprisingly robust. While he did battle occasional fevers and his eyesight was weak, he was not the sickly child that legends suggest. He was educated by the best scholars England had to offer, molded into a thinking machine, a Protestant prince destined to solidify the break from Rome. And then, in the cold of January, in the year 1547, King Henry VIII died. Edward, just 9 years old, became Edward VI, a boy king perched on a throne stained with his father's contradictions, flanked on all sides by ambitious men hiding knives behind smiles. His reign, though brief, was relentless. The Reformation did not merely continue, it accelerated. Churches were stripped, Catholic relics burned, monasteries plundered. Edward, through his regents, pushed for a purified, radical Protestantism that saw no room for compromise. The England he inherited became a battlefield of faith, not with armies, but with edicts, interrogations, and silence where Latin chants once rang. And yet, as Edward the Reformer shaped a new kingdom, Edward, the human, the boy beneath the crown, was slowly unraveling from within. By the spring of the year 1553, the signs were undeniable. A violent cough, a high fever, a terrible swelling of the limbs. Edward was dying. Some whispered of poison, others spoke of tuberculosis. Either way, he was fading, and every advisor around him knew that the throne was in danger. In one final act of defiance, he rewrote the line of succession, bypassing his Catholic half-sister Mary and naming his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his heir. Then, on the 6th of July in the same year, at just 15 years old, Edward died, leaving behind a fragile crown, a divided country, and a legacy built on unfulfilled potential. What followed was chaos. Lady Jane Grey ruled for just 9 days before Mary seized the throne, dragged Jane to the scaffold, and began her reign of Catholic vengeance. Hundreds were burned. The streets of London reeked with the smoke of heresy. Then came Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, who ruled for 45 years and turned England into an empire. But none of that would have happened if Edward had lived. Jane would not have died. Mary would not have become Bloody Mary. Elizabeth may have found love, married Robert Dudley, and borne heirs instead of burying her heart beneath the crown. But the alternative is no fairy tale. If Edward had survived, England may have plunged deeper into religious extremism. War with Scotland would likely have intensified ire, sparked by the failed betrothal between Edward and the infant Mary, Queen of Scots. That old wound, the broken Treaty of Greenwich, would have festered into open conflict. Mary, born of Catholic blood and burning with royal entitlement, would not have remained silent, while a Protestant king ruled a kingdom she believed was hers by right and by God. If Edward had lived, the Protestant Reformation would not have slowed. It would have become a machine. The Catholic Church in England might have been utterly crushed. A Spanish invasion, perhaps fueled by a marriage alliance between Mary and Philip of Spain, could have come sooner. Fiercer, bloodier. Elizabeth, never crowned, might have died in obscurity, or been married off into irrelevance. The plays of Shakespeare may never have graced the Globe Theatre. The Armada may never have met its storm. The identity of England, its myths, its glory, its darkness would have been rewritten entirely. All of it, every single twist of fate, begins with a boy coughing up blood in a bed at Greenwich. A boy who died too young. A boy whose death created a vacuum so great that 3 queens were dragged into it. One burned, one broke, and one ruled alone. Edward was not a footnote in Tudor history. He was the hinge. The door that slammed shut when he died did not just close on his own future, it locked away 100 alternate lives. 1,000 unspoken names, and perhaps even the Tudor dynasty itself. And so, whenever we whisper the name Edward VI, we are not just mourning a child king, we are mourning the world that never was. It was the 7th night of July, in the year 1553, and the wind from the river carried no sound but the coughing of the boy who was supposed to die. They had told his physicians to prepare for the end. And for days now, they had walked on tiptoe through the corridors of Greenwich, speaking only in whispers and in Latin, as if silence itself might bargain with death. The candles had already been lit for the vigil. The court had already begun to mourn. But Edward did not die. Instead, on the morning of the 8th, the fever broke. Not dramatically, not miraculously, no saintly glow, no angelic vision, no sudden gasp of air as if the soul had been returned. It was quieter than that. A little more color in the cheeks, less blood in the handkerchief. The eyes stayed open longer. The voice, once thin as thread. I managed to whisper a full sentence. I am still here. And somehow, he was, across the hall. The surgeons, who had already begun composing the wording for their testimonies, turned pale. The embalmers who had been summoned quietly folded their linen and went home without a word. Lady Mary, who had ridden south, expecting to see her half-brother one last time, arrived only to find the boy sitting upright, staring out the window at the summer sky, pale and skeletal, but breathing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Edward, in a voice hoarse with dust and healing, said simply, "I have changed the order of succession." And just like that, history cracked. The July that should have been remembered as the death of a king became instead the month that a crown stopped trembling. No tomb was carved. No succession crisis unfolded. No Queen of 9 Days ever sat upon the throne. Lady Jane Grey was never told to wear the ermine. Her name, once destined for tragedy, became a footnote instead, a quiet, of devout girl who kept to her books and lived long enough to watch the world forget her. But the world had not calmed. It had merely shifted. For Edward had seen the face of death, and it had not been merciful. What returned from that sickbed was not the boy of yesterday. It was someone else. Someone with eyes too old for 15. Someone who had seen the thin edge between the living and the dead, and decided he would never walk it again. He ruled now not through counsel, not through Seymour, not through smiling men with smooth tongues and hidden swords. He ruled because he had survived when none expected it. And survival, in Tudor England, was the one thing no one could question. His first act was to send Mary away. Not in chains, not in disgrace that would have stirred sympathy. Instead, she was gifted a manor, a household, a library, and a polite but final letter requesting her retirement from court. She left with white knuckles and dry eyes, and she would never again stand beneath the stained glass windows of Westminster as anything more than a memory. The people, mostly, did not object. They were tired of faith, of fire, of fear. They wanted certainty. Edward gave them policy, but even certainty had a cost. The problem now was marriage. He was young, yes, but no longer fragile. And in the eyes of Europe, Edward Tudor had transformed from a dying child into a valuable prince with an actual future. The suitors arrived like storm clouds, German envoys with Protestant daughters, Scandinavian dukes offering alliances, even whispers from the Swiss cantons of a match that might unite the fiercest corners of reformist thought. But none of these pleased him, because none of these were Mary, Queen of Scots. It had once been a treaty back when Edward was a baby, and Mary was only months old, signed in ink and sealed in gold. A promise between two crowns. The Treaty of Greenwich. They had called it a dream of peace between England and Scotland, to be realized in a wedding long in the future. But Scotland had broken it. Mary had been sent to France. And now, in this new world, the old dream returned, not because it was wise, but because it was Edward's idea of justice. He would bring her back, not by force. Not at first. Letters were written carefully worded, drenched in courtesy, signed with the seal of a king who had come back from death and now spoke like a prophet. He reminded the French court of old promises, invoked honor, hinted at divine providence. He offered peace, alliance, and a wedding that would make both their kingdoms unshakable. But France and Mary's guardians did not listen. So the king began to plan for war. It would not be a war of fire and sack. Not yet. He had learned from the failures of his uncle. Instead, it would be a war of patience, trade pressure, naval drills, quiet support for Scottish Protestants, whispers of rebellion in the Highlands. He would not march north with banners just yet. He would wait, because Edward was no longer in a hurry. He had seen how slowly death crept and how surely it came. But even as the drums beat softly beneath the surface, something unexpected happened. He began to dream of her. He had never met Mary, not in truth. But she appeared now in his sleep not as a threat, not as a rival, but as a girl standing beside a river, barefoot in the grass, her crown tilted, her eyes the same dark color as his own. She did not speak in these dreams. She only looked at him, and sometimes she smiled. In the morning, he said nothing of it. Kings did not speak of dreams, but when he rewrote the liturgy to include a prayer for the unity of all Christian princes under one reformed crown, his chaplains did not ask questions. And when he ordered the minting of a new coin, one with his face on one side and a Tudor rose entwined with a thistle on the other, the artisans did not speak aloud, the name that inspired it. But still, there was no wedding. Not because he lacked the will, but because history, even when bent, does not always break where we expect it to. Mary remained in France. And Edward, now 16, then 17, watched the seasons pass without her. He turned to reform again. He abolished old taxes, funded grammar schools, pushed the new Book of Common Prayer into every parish. His rule became firm, even admired. But the court grew colder, the nights longer. His health returned, but joy did not, for he had lived. Yes, but in living, he had lost what death might have spared him, the comfort of being remembered with sorrow, rather than judged with expectation. And somewhere, in a French chateau, Mary grew older too. She married a prince not of England, but of Valois. She wore French silks, spoke in French tongue, and learned to dance in the old style. She never saw the English coast again. She never stood beside Edward in a chapel filled with roses and treaties and whispered promises. The wedding never happened. But sometimes, when the wind was just right, and the bells of Westminster rang before dawn, Edward would stand at his window, eyes fixed north, and imagine her still barefoot in the grass. He had changed the course of history. But history, it seemed, had changed him too. She had once walked through palaces like they were built for her. Tapestries parted for her shadow. Courtiers bowed a breath lower when her red silk hem swept across the floor. She had been born into rank, not power, not yet, but the promise of it shimmered around her like candlelight around gold. Mary, first daughter of Henry VIII, had been a princess, and once, for a fleeting season, she had even been the heir. But now in this England where Edward lived, she was something far more difficult, a sister without a place, a woman without a title, a ghost that history no longer needed. When the fever did not take her brother, something else did. Her future, her name, her right. In the spring of that strange year, 1553, the crown had shifted like sand under her feet. And by summer, it was gone. Edward recovered. The court rejoiced. The prayers of the realm answered, but not hers. Mary had prayed too. She had fasted, whispered every bead of the rosary until her lips bled, bargaining with a God who seemed to have once smiled on her mother and then turned away forever. She had whispered her father's name to Henry, the lion who had called her his pearl, even as he banished her mother and left her to cry alone in damp corridors. But her father was gone now. Her God was silent. And her brother, whom she had once rocked in her arms, had become something she no longer recognized. Edward did not banish her with cruelty. He did not shout, or accuse, or chain her, as she feared he might. No, it was something colder. The gift of a house in the countryside, a stipend, letters signed with love and the duty of a sovereign. Her servants were chosen for her, her priest dismissed, her chapels emptied of candles. And when she protested softly at first, then more fiercely she was told, always politely, always with a nod, that it was for her safety, that the realm could not afford division, that her presence at court made the people uneasy, that unity came first. And so Mary went quietly, as noble women do when they are given no choice but silence. Her estate was a fine one, tucked between wooded hills in Suffolk, surrounded by low stone walls and fields of sheep. There were books in Latin, Flemish glass in the windows, and the scent of lavender in every room. The servants curtsied deeply and called her, "Your Grace." Even when no one was listening, she lit her own candles for Mass. She whispered to the saints when the walls would allow. She received no visitors, but the occasional envoy from court, bearing updates she had not asked for, always signed in her brother's thin, angular hand. She aged without notice. No portraits were commissioned. No festivals held in her name. Her hair grayed, not with time, but with grief slowly, in streaks like frost on a window pane. Her smile, once small and careful, disappeared entirely. There was no joy in being tolerated, but she watched. Oh yes, she watched, from the safety of her exile. Mary read everything that came her way. She learned of her brother's decrees, each new act of uniformity, each dissolution of a convent, each change to the prayer books. She read of his strengthening alliances with German dukes, of the silent war he waged against Rome, of the English tongue being forced upon liturgy like iron upon wood. She read about the merchants in Antwerp praising Edward's cleverness, and the bishops in Lincolnshire fearing his resolve, and in all of it, in every dispatch, every decree, every reshaping of England's soul, her name was never mentioned. She existed now in the footnotes of a kingdom she had once been promised. And still, she did not return to court. Only once did she come close. It was on the feast of St. Michael, in the year 1555. A wedding had been rumored Edward to a German princess of stern Protestant lineage. The court had buzzed with gossip. The bells in London were polished and prepared, their iron throats waiting to sing. And Mary, perhaps out of longing, or perhaps curiosity, had written a letter. She did not ask to attend. She knew better than to beg, but she offered, with careful words and painstaking humility, her blessings for the union. She said she prayed for Edward's happiness. She asked, gently, whether the Mass would still be banned from the chapel. No reply ever came. Instead, news trickled back weeks later that the match had collapsed. The princess had declined. Edward had changed his mind. No wedding. No alliance. No joy. Mary folded the news in silence and placed it among the others in the drawer where she kept her old coronet, her mother's crucifix, and the pearls her father had once said matched her smile. She walked daily in the gardens after that. Alone. Always. Her ladies whispered about her behind embroidered fans. They said she was becoming cold, that her eyes seemed to look past them now, that she no longer cried, not even during the morning readings from the Book of Hours, because somewhere deep inside, Mary had already died once the day her brother lived. And yet, she endured, through winter colds and summer droughts, through the reshaping of England into a place she no longer recognized, through the endless silence from court and the slow unraveling of everything she had once believed immutable. Mary remained. She refused marriage. No Spanish prince. No Catholic duke. No treaty sealed with her womb. She would not be used. She refused exile abroad. Even when the Pope himself invited her to Rome, "I was born in England," she told her confessor, "and I will not let it forget me." She refused despair. Not openly. Not while the sun still set in the west and the chapel door still opened. Even if it opened only to her. But something had left her. Something essential. Something only her mother might have recognized, a warmth in the eyes. A gentleness in the corners of the mouth. They called her the Princess of the Cross. They said she had found peace in sacrifice. But they were wrong. Mary Tudor had not found peace. She had simply learned how to disappear without vanishing. They had taught him that a king must marry not out of affection, not for comfort, and certainly never for longing, but because duty demanded it. A kingdom needed heirs. A throne needed continuity. A dynasty, especially one as blood-soaked and brittle as the Tudors, needed to breed in order to survive. And yet, Edward, the boy who had once been dying and then was not, had reached the age of 20 and remained alone. It was not for lack of effort. The court had sent out its feelers like vines, slow, patient, persistent, daughters of German counts, Swedish duchesses, Protestant princesses from the Rhine and the northern snow. They arrived in portraits and letters, and sometimes in person, each one polite, well-bred, and terrifying in their perfection. They bowed, they smiled, they quoted scripture, they waited. But Edward, pale, watchful Edward, offered only silence. He was not cruel. He did not mock them. He met them when protocol required, and nodded with the proper grace. He spoke of governance, of theology, of reform and law, but not of gardens, not of music, not of the way the sun looked when it touched the stone of Hampton Court in late afternoon. He had been trained in the art of ruling, not the art of feeling. And so, he could not love, or perhaps more truthfully, he would not, for Edward had lived through the death of his mother before he could remember her face. He had seen how love broke men, how it bent kings, how it twisted his father Henry into a man who burned wives like parchment when they disappointed him. He had watched Jane Grey be offered as a bride to the nation, then devoured by the very machine that raised her. He had seen the tenderness between his sister Elizabeth and Robert Dudley, a tenderness never allowed to bloom. He had read letters, diaries, sermons, confessions, and in all of it, love looked too much like hunger, and not enough like safety. He had seen what love cost, and he had no wish to pay. But England was not patient. The people had forgiven his long recovery. They had endured his reforms. They had watched him grow from the shadow of a child into the silhouette of a monarch. But they had waited long enough. Rumors whispered through taverns and manors and marketplaces that the king was barren, that he was unwell again, that he was being poisoned slowly by his own advisors. Or worse, that he simply did not desire women at all. That the Tudor line, their line, would end with a man who could recite entire psalms from memory but could not bear to touch a wife. The Privy Council grew uneasy. Parliament sharpened its questions. Ambassadors began to write in a different tone, less reverent, more cautious. The Pope in Rome, still furious and exiled from English soil, was said to have chuckled when told that Edward had rejected yet another bride. And beneath it all, the kingdom began to ache. There were still no monasteries, and the poor lined the alleys of London in greater numbers than ever. The merchant class thrived, but the countryside withered. The nobles grew fat and bitter. The bishops argued more fiercely, and through it all, the court watched their unmarried king drift further from their expectations, like a ship that had slipped anchor in a rising tide. Then came the question of Elizabeth. She had never been meant to rule not in this world, not where Edward lived. She had accepted that once, had even welcomed it. But now, as the years passed, and no children came from her brother's loins, something in her began to stir. She never said it aloud. She was too clever for that. But she smiled more often. She wore gowns that reminded the court of her mother. Anne Boleyn silks, golden trim, daring sleeves that flared like fire. She danced more. She spoke in riddles. She held books of Virgil and spoke of fate. And slowly, like ivy, creeping up the stone of a cathedral. The question bloomed if Edward will not wed. Will Elizabeth inherit? Edward said nothing. He watched, and in the nights, when he walked the stone halls alone, wrapped in fur and burdened with silence, he thought not of Elizabeth, nor of Mary, nor of the girls whose portraits stared blankly from their frames. He thought of a woman who had never been his portraits, Mary, Queen of Scots. She had married a French prince, then returned to Scotland, a widow. She had claimed her throne with fire in her eyes and Catholic mass in her bones. She wrote letters now angry, elegant things that crossed the border like arrows. She signed them Mary. By the grace of God, Queen of Scots, and rightful Queen of England. Edward burned them. Always. Without reading past the first line. But he felt her still at the edge of every shadow, in the mouth of every ambassador who dared suggest compromise. She was the bride he had never claimed, the war he had never won. He wondered sometimes if he had made a mistake not by surviving, but by assuming survival was enough. A crown without a queen was a song without harmony. A kingdom without an heir was a prayer with no answer. And yet still, he could not bring himself to choose, because to choose meant to be vulnerable, and vulnerability had no place in the throne room. By the time he reached 23, the pressure became unbearable. The council threatened, the people murmured. Foreign princes began to measure England's strength, not by its fleet, but by its bloodline. And one winter morning, with frost curling along the stained glass of Windsor, Edward made a decision not to marry, but to name an heir. It was Elizabeth. Not because he loved her, he didn't, and not because he trusted her, he didn't, but because she was strong, because she was sharp, because she had survived everything that should have broken her, and because, in the end, he saw himself in her, not the child he had once been, but the strange, a quiet thing. He had become a creature of duty, of steel, of solitude. He summoned her alone. No advisors, no scribes, just brother and sister, as they had once been. He told her what he had done, signed the papers, sealed the future. She did not thank him. She did not weep. She only asked one question. Will you live long enough to regret this? Edward looked at her for a long time, and then he said, very quietly, no. There was a cellar beneath Hatfield House, lined with old wine barrels, broken portraits, and forgotten trunks draped in velvet rot. Most who lived there avoided it not from fear, but from a certain kind of reverence, as one might avoid the drawer where a dead mother's jewelry is kept. But once a year, usually in late spring when the hawthorn began to bloom, the princess went down alone. Elizabeth. She descended without a torch. She knew the way, by memory, past the old hunting tapestries her father had ordered, torn down, past the cracked bust of Saint Cecilia, whose eyes had turned to dust. There, behind the third arch, tucked in a cedar chest so old that no key remained, lay the dress, not hers, but made for her, ivory silk, stitched with Tudor roses, sleeves trimmed in pearls so fine they seemed to sigh when touched, a veil of French lace, never worn, slippers with soles that had never touched earth, a crown of pale gold, not for state, not for coronation, but for a wedding. Edward had commissioned it in secret, in a year that never happened, for a marriage that never came. The match had been discussed quietly, between Edward and a distant German duchess, a girl of good reformist blood, modest temperament, and lungs as frail as glass. He had never met her. He had no intention to, but the union would have pleased the council, settled the court, soothed the rumors. The dress had been made out of duty. But as the weeks passed, and the negotiations stumbled, and Edward found newer reasons to delay, the wedding vanished like breath in winter. The Duchess was married elsewhere. The dress was packed away, and Elizabeth found it. Not by accident. Nothing she did was accidental. She found it one summer, when the servants were napping and the house was empty, and Edward was away at court. She had opened the chest, found the gown, folded like a ghost, and stood there for a long time, one finger tracing the embroidery of a Tudor rose wrapped around a thistle. The crown's band fit her exactly. She never told Edward. She never told anyone. But each year, when the world outside was blooming, she returned to the cellar and stood before the dress. And not once, not even in the darkest hour of her loneliness, did she ever try it on, because to wear it would have meant admitting it had once been hers. And Elizabeth, like her brother, had grown skilled in the art of pretending. They no longer spoke easily. Not since he had named her heir. It should have drawn them closer. But instead it left a silence between them. Heavier than ever. Edward ruled with calculation, with policy, with the slow tightening of logic like a vice. Elizabeth, in contrast, ruled nothing, not yet, and so she moved like air, slipping between courtiers, learning their secrets, smiling without meaning, speaking only when it served her. They were two sides of the same blade, honed by the same war, a war not of armies, but of inheritance, of memory, of the crown. Still, sometimes he summoned her. Once, in winter, he asked her to dine. The meal was sparse. He had grown thinner again, not from illness, he claimed, but from fasting, from the burden of kingship. She watched him pick at a piece of cold mutton and speak of laws, of land disputes, of merchant taxes. Then, without lifting his eyes, he asked her the question she had feared most. "Will you marry?" She did not flinch. "No," she said. "Why?" "Because you haven't." There was silence, and then Edward, without blinking, said, "Good." After that, they did not speak again for many months. She spent her days in letters, in Greek, in gardens. She wrote poetry, then burned it. She received invitations to court and declined them. She wrote in the woods, her red hair trailing like fire behind her. And sometimes, very rarely, she dreamed of the child she would never have. A boy, perhaps, with her father's chin, her mother's eyes, a girl with long fingers and laughter in her bones, children who would never exist, because she had learned, like Edward, that love was not safety, that marriage was not haven, that heirs were not promises, only weights. But there was a deeper truth she never confessed. She had loved, once, before Edward named her, before Mary faded into silence, before she hardened into myth. It had been Robert Charming, reckless, brilliant Robert Dudley, the boy with quick hands and clever words. They had grown up together in the shadow of towers, in the echo of executions, children whose parents had once danced on the edge of disaster and dragged their legacies behind them like chains. Robert had loved her, perhaps still did, but when he knelt not once, but twice, she had turned her face away. Not because she did not feel it, but because she did, because she knew what would happen if she said yes, that the world would call her weak, that the crown, still floating just beyond reach, would slip away, that she would become her mother, Anne Boleyn, brilliant, broken, beheaded. So she let him go. He married another, a woman whose name Elizabeth never spoke. And then Elizabeth, each spring, walked down into the cellar and stood before a dress meant for a bride that she had refused to become. Above her, England moved on. Edward ruled quietly. More scholar than king, he passed reforms, funded orphanages, wrote theological treatises that no one read. His people respected him, but they did not love him. The fires of the Reformation had cooled into ash, and the court grew bored. They wanted a wedding. They wanted joy. They wanted pageants, airs, fireworks above the Thames. But all they had were 2 Tudors, a king who would not marry, and a sister who would not kneel. The child never came. The cradle stayed empty. The dress in the cellar yellowed at the edges, and the dreams it once held faded into dust. And yet, Elizabeth endured, because she knew something they didn't. She knew that power, once tasted, left no room for longing, that crowns did not belong to wives, or mothers, or girls in gowns. They belonged to survivors, and she would survive, no matter what it cost her. Even if it meant walking alone, even if it meant never again smiling the way she once had freely. Foolishly, like a girl who still believed she might wear white. There were whispers in the choir stalls long before there were names, and long before there were accusations. There were glances, not from the pulpit, not from the nobles who sat beneath carved saints and marble archways, but from the boys in white, those who sang at dawn and at dusk, those who watched everything from behind their hymns. They saw who entered the chapel late, who left early, who murmured verses louder than others as if they had something to prove. And one of them, a boy whose name was never written down, but who had perfect pitch and eyes the color of slate, watched more closely than the rest. He had been placed there not to learn music, not to serve God, not even to be educated, as so many choir boys were, but to listen. He was a spy, a quiet one, planted not by Edward himself, but by one of the men who served the crown from the shadows. A man whose face even the king did not often see. It had begun with a rumor, not the kind shouted in taverns or scribbled in pamphlets, but the quiet kind. The kind that blooms like mold in the cracks of power, that someone in the royal chapel, someone close to the altar, was not singing to praise but to conspire. The king had refused to believe it. At first the chapel was sacred, untouched, filled with Latin and incense and the footsteps of angels. But England had changed, and faith no longer meant safety. And even the stone walls of Westminster could not keep secrets buried for long. The boy was sent in without a name, told only to watch, to listen, and to remember. And he did. For 3 months. He said nothing. Then, one dusk, in early November, when the shadows came early and the stained glass caught the last of the dying sun, he saw it. A folded note, passed from gloved hand to gloved hand, tucked beneath the cushion of a pew and retrieved before the final verse. He did not see the words, but he saw the face of the man who took it. A man who should not have been there. His name was Thomas Culverwell, a minor baron by birth. Once, a soldier in Edward's northern campaigns, now a courtier with quiet eyes and a habit of disappearing during council. He had served with distinction in the Scottish troubles, had lost a brother to French fire on the coast, and had gained the king's trust, not through brilliance, but through stillness. He was always where he was meant to be, and never where he was not. Until now. The boy reported it the next morning. to a clerk, who spoke with no inflection, and disappeared before the hour struck. Within a week, Thomas Culverwell was under surveillance, and within another, he was gone. No arrest, no trial, no formal accusation. On the morning he vanished, his chambers were found empty, the bed unslept, the fire cold, the inkpot still wet beside a blank sheet of parchment. His horse remained in the stables, his sword sheathed. No one had seen him leave. No one remembered when they last heard his voice. Only the bells remembered. That same morning, the bells of Westminster, those enormous mouths of bronze that rang only for death or triumph, refused to toll for matins. The ropes hung slack. The air was still. And for one long hour, the kingdom held its breath. Edward did not speak of it. When asked, he merely shook his head, said something vague about diplomatic postings and the need for quiet service abroad. But those who had served long enough knew better. And those who had ears to the ground heard what was not said, that Culverwell had been at the center of something larger. Something that had reached all the way to the altar and nearly touched the throne. The plot, it seemed, had been real. They called it the Choir Conspiracy, a name too poetic for the mud beneath it. No official records were kept. But in the months that followed, 3 priests were quietly dismissed. A steward disappeared from the royal kitchens. One of the king's scribes was found drowned in the Thames, his fingers cut off. And the boy, the one with the perfect pitch, was granted a scholarship to Cambridge and never returned to court. Only Edward knew the full truth. He kept the note that had been passed in the chapel, now retrieved, read, and burned in his memory like a splinter. Its words were brief, almost unremarkable. She will move at Candlemas. The bells will ring. No names, no locations. Only a date. Only a signal. The she, they believed, was Mary, Queen of Scots, still stirring the north with her letters, still claiming England with her breath. The bells, they feared, were not Westminster's, but those of St. Andrew's, which had not rung in years, which would only be heard again if Scotland fell into her hands and turned southward. Culverwell, it seemed, had been her knife not to kill, but to unlock. He had moved among the court not to spill blood, but to shift alliances, and he had nearly done it. Edward, in the months that followed, changed. He became sharper, quieter. The court grew colder. The mass was banned entirely. Even in private households, bishops were rotated, ambassadors were watched, and no one, not even Elizabeth, was permitted into the royal chapel without 3 witnesses and 2 guards. The altar had been compromised. Trust, once shaken, never returned. And so, when Edward next walked into the choir, he did not bow. He did not pray. He only listened, not to the voices of boys, not to the hymns of faith, but to the echo of his own footsteps, and the sound of a crown being worn by someone who knew that not even God's house was beyond the reach of a traitor. In the old wing of Richmond Palace, where the wood panels whispered and the windows sighed in winter, there was a room. No one entered without permission, a narrow chamber with faded drapes, dust-heavy air, and a door that clicked softly shut behind you, even when no wind stirred. It was not listed in the ledgers. It had no official keeper. The guards passed it each evening, never looking in. But once a week, just after midnight, the king entered alone. Edward, he brought no torch. He needed none. The room was lit, always by a single candle. Fresh wicked, waiting, though no servant ever claimed to light it. The air smelled faintly of parchment and lavender oil, as though someone had tried to make it gentle, though no visitor ever stayed long enough to grow used to it. At the far end, behind a curtain of heavy wool, hung a portrait. It was not signed. It was not dated. And it did not hang in any gallery. It was a woman young, dark-eyed, seated, one hand folded across her belly. She wore no crown, no embroidery. Her gown was soft blue, the kind worn in private rooms or for quiet walks. And her gaze unflinching, unblinking, seemed to search for something just beyond the edge of the canvas. In her lap rested a ring of gold, delicate, untouched. She was no one, and she was everything. Her name was never written down, her likeness never commissioned, but Edward had ordered the portrait painted in secret. And the man who painted it was sent to Florence before the varnish had dried. Some said she had been a maid, a noblewoman's niece, a chamberlain's daughter. Others whispered she had been Spanish dark, careful, Catholic. The truth was known only to the king, and he never spoke it. Only one other person ever entered the room. Not Elizabeth, not the council, not the bishop. A boy no older than 10, no younger than 7, chestnut-haired, pale-skinned, always silent. He would arrive through the back stairs, cloaked and led by a man with no title. He was brought into the room, left alone for 1 hour, then let out again without a word. No guard marked the visits, no scribe recorded his name, but Edward waited, just beyond the door, every time. And when the child left, the king would enter, stand before the curtain, draw it back, and whisper something beneath his breath that no soul could ever hear. The child was never introduced. No one called him prince, but he walked like someone who had been taught to bow and to receive bows in return. And the servants who passed him in the garden sometimes said that he held his chin the way Edward did, high, tight, uncertain, and that when he stood in sunlight, the freckles beneath his eyes were shaped like the wings of a sparrow. Rumors. Of course, there was no heir. That was the official truth. Elizabeth stood next in line. Parliament had approved it. The people accepted it. But still, every so often, a rider was seen leaving Richmond under cover of night, traveling south without crest or banner, returning before dawn with books, letters, small packages wrapped in velvet and sealed with wax so soft it bore no mark. In time, the rumors took form not spoken aloud, but felt in the spaces between courtly greetings, in the hush that followed, when someone mentioned succession too casually, or when the king looked west through the stained glass, as though expecting someone to walk toward him across the river. There had been a woman, there had been a child, but no marriage, no witnesses, no blessing from the bishops, only silence deep, careful, absolute. And in that silence lived a secret so heavy that even Edward, who had carried a kingdom on his shoulders since he was 9 years old, I could not speak of it without closing his eyes. He had loved her. Once. Briefly. Not the way songs are sung or poems are written. There were no moonlit balconies. No letters scented with rose oil. No rendezvous behind garden hedges. But there had been hours stolen, ones filled with breath and trembling and the unspoken belief that just for a moment he might live like other men. But he had not been made for joy. He had been made for duty. And when the child came, she did not ask for anything. No title. No place. Not even a ring. Only that the boy be kept safe. And so Edward, who could never be the husband she needed, became something else, a distant guardian, a shadow father, a silent watcher from a throne too high to ever kneel again. He gave the child tutors, food, books, protection, but not his name. Not the name that would place a target on the child's back. Not the name that would force Elizabeth to turn slowly into her father. Not the name that would make the boy the answer to every question no one dared ask. So the boy grew, and Edward aged, alone, not old in years, but in breath, in bone, in that hollowed-out space behind the ribs where love used to live. The portrait never moved, the candle never failed, and the kingdom restless, loyal, and blind waited for a son who had already been born, and a truth that would never be spoken until the day the bells rang again. The bells began ringing on a Thursday, just after sunset, when the air was damp with spring and the sky over London had turned the color of ash. No proclamation had been made. No procession had moved through the city gates. But still, they rang great bronze mouths calling out across the Thames, echoing off the rooftops like a prayer or a warning or something between the two. And the people, hearing them, stepped out into the streets barefoot, breathless, with hands half raised as if they might catch what the sound could not say. Some believed the king was dead. Others believed the Spanish had come. A few wept before they even knew why. But Edward was not dead. Not yet. He had risen that morning as he always did. Pale but precise. Dressed in black velvet and reading a letter from the Archbishop about the matter of coinage in York. His handwriting remained steady. His voice, though softer now, had not lost its authority. He met with the Chancellor, nodded through discussions of trade, and took his midday walk beneath the elms with only 2 guards instead of 3. But something was different. Not visible, not to the courtiers, not to the council, not even to the physicians who came each week to take his pulse and count his breath. No cough, no fever, no visible sign of decline. But behind his eyes, something had begun to dim. Not his sight, not his intellect, but the will that had once held his body upright when it should have collapsed, the will that had carried him through illness after illness, through cold rooms and lonely hours, through sermons and signatures and silences too heavy for any boy to bear which had defied death before, was now beginning to slip. He had known for weeks. The candle burned shorter each night. The portrait in the hidden room had begun to curl at the corners. The letters from Elizabeth were more frequent now, more careful. Her pen dancing just above the edge of accusation, asking not what was wrong, but when she should come. But Edward did not answer, because what he felt and could not name was not disease. Not quite. It was a kind of exhaustion that lived in the marrow. Not tiredness, not despair, but the knowledge that the story he had fought so long to write, the story of a kingdom held together by logic and reform and silence, was now being edited by hands. He could no longer stop. The council was restless. Elizabeth was waiting. The boy, the one he had never named, was growing into a mirror too perfect to be ignored. And the bells had rung too soon. He heard them from his chambers. And for a moment, he thought he was dreaming. Then he rose, slowly, and walked to the window. He saw the crowd gathering below. Faces turned upward. Eyes full of something between hope and dread. He knew what they wanted. A glimpse of the king. A reassurance. A sign that he still held the weight of the crown, and would not let it fall. So he opened the window. He stood there, framed by leaded glass, the wind tugging softly at the collar of his coat, and looked down at a city that had long ago stopped being his Prusse. He did not wave. He did not smile. He simply looked, and the people, seeing him, wept. Because they knew. Because there are moments when a face, even without words, even without farewell, says everything. The bells quieted by midnight. No announcement followed. But the court, like any living thing, sensed what was coming. Elizabeth arrived the next day. She did not ask permission. She did not bring ceremony. She entered the palace in gray, not mourning. Not yet, and made her way through the halls like smoke. Soft and deliberate, she found her brother in the small chamber he preferred now. Away from the throne room. Near the garden that bloomed only with white flowers. He was seated, pale hands folded. A book closed beside him. They did not embrace. They did not need to. "I thought you would come," he said. "I never left," she answered. That night, they spoke not of crowns or heirs or treaties, but of childhood, of a falcon he once loved that had flown too far, of a poem she had written and buried in the garden, of their mother, though neither had known her. And when he fell asleep, head tilted gently, mouth barely open, she did not wake him. He did not die that night, nor the next. But something had fallen. Not his body, but the silence that had surrounded his reign. The quiet control that had kept his court obedient and his council docilate, shattered like thin ice under too many feet. The advisors began to speak openly now, sometimes without his presence. The bishops debated Elizabeth's claim. Foreign envoys prepared letters addressed to her grace. And in the dark hours, even the most loyal among them rehearsed a future without him. And Edward, watching it all, did not stop them. Because the throne heavy, brilliant, blood-stained had already begun to slide from beneath him, not by treachery, not by rebellion, but by time. The bells had rung too soon. But still, they had rung, and in doing so, they had awakened a kingdom that would not wait for the breath to leave his lungs. When he died days later, in silence, beneath white lilies and candle smoke, it was said that his lips had moved once, as if speaking a name, though no one could say whose. Some believed it was Elizabeth, others, the boy. A few whispered that it was Mary. But the truth, like the air, like the woman in the portrait, like the bells themselves, remained unnamed, and the throne polished, waiting. Inevitable did not wait. He was never meant to live. That was the secret buried beneath every prayer spoken over him, every hand that touched his forehead, every candle lit outside the walls of the palace, while his body burned with fever in the summer of his 15th year. The world had prepared itself for a clean ending, a coffin, a crown passed, a tragedy mourned quickly and reshaped into legend, a Protestant boy king who died too young to be dangerous. That would have been easy. That would have been tidy. That would have allowed history to move forward like it always does. With certainty, with rhythm, with myth. But Edward did not die. And so England dreamed a dream that was too long, too deep, and too strange to ever fully wake from. His life, the years that should not have been, became the stone dropped in still water, rippling outward through everything, through Mary, whose flame flickered in exile, through Elizabeth, who hardened like iron wrapped in silk, through a boy with no name and a portrait behind a curtain, through choirs and corridors and council chambers, where each footstep had to be measured against the echo of his quiet breath. He ruled without fire, without spectacle. He gave no speeches that stirred blood. He won no wars that inspired songs. He wore the crown like a scholar might wear a collar tight. Dutiful. Itchy with responsibility. His legacy was not written in glory. It was written in margin notes, in legal codes, in silences that lasted longer than they should have. He believed in reason more than ritual, and perhaps that is why the people never quite loved him, because he offered them policy instead of poetry. And in the end, it is poetry that survives. And yet, it was because he lived that so much never came to be. There was no Bloody Mary, no fires lit in Smithfield. There was no Virgin Queen, no golden age of Gloriana. The Armada never sailed. The Globe Theatre never stood. William Shakespeare, if born at all, might have died in obscurity. His words unspoken. His ink never dried. There was no age of wonder, no age of defiance. There was only continuity, order, a kingdom that did not collapse, but never quite rose either. Because sometimes, when the wrong man lives, the right world never does. That is not to say Edward was cruel. He was not, nor unwise. But wisdom is not warmth, and a crown worn without love becomes a burden too heavy to lift others with it. He held England steady, but it never soared. Elizabeth buried him herself, not with her hands, but with her gaze. She stood by the coffin in Westminster, surrounded by men who would soon kneel to her. And she did not weep, not in public, not before the marble saints. She looked down at her brother, dressed in black and gold, lips pressed in sleep, and she whispered one sentence that no one heard, not the priests, not the guards, not even the stone angels carved above her. Then she turned, and the world turned with her. The boy, the one from the portrait room, vanished. His guardians returned to the north. The papers were burned, the records erased. Perhaps Elizabeth knew. Perhaps she did not blink, but no one ever asked. And no one ever dared mention the word heir again for many years. In time, a myth grew, that Edward had died with regret, that he had wished for something more, not a longer life, but a fuller one, that he had once tried to sing, and could not, that he had once fallen in love, and did not know how to say the words, that the England he dreamed of, efficient, educated, devout but unfeeling, had become a palace of glass, cold and beautiful, but impossible to live in. And so when Elizabeth ruled, she did so in color. She wore fire on her sleeves and secrets in her smile. She danced. She hunted. She flirted with princes and laughed in Parliament. She gave England not the quiet it thought it wanted, but the theater it did not know it needed. She became everything her brother could not be. And for that, the people remembered her. But somewhere, deep in the folds of the kingdom, in the footnotes of forgotten ledgers, in the hidden doors behind altar walls, Edward remained, not as a boy who died young, but as a man who lived too long, a man who held the dream so tightly in his hands that it shattered, and he never told anyone that the cuts never healed. And so, if tonight you find yourself still awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet, wondering why some kings are remembered and others are not, think of him. Not the Edward in the paintings, but the one who once stood in the window, above the crowds, as the bells rang too soon, the one who blinked against the wind and said nothing, because he had already said everything that mattered, and none of it had been enough. And then, close your eyes, because now, the dream is done, and England at last may sleep.